Good morning. Happy Monday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. Okay. Hope you had a great weekend. Busy week coming up. Let's dive into today's Q&A for Monday. This comes from Brian. Brian prefaced his question as a hamstring question, but I think it's going to be a little bit more than that, Brian. So let's break this down. Brian says, if an individual presents with a significant anterior orientation of the pelvis with a significant limitation in bilateral hip ER, so that is a pretty good indication that you've got the anterior orientation when you lose the hip ER. Would it be worthwhile to focus on proximal hamstrings at 30 to 60 degrees of hip flexion to reorient the pelvis and possibly attempt to bias the lateral hamstrings to promote more hip ER? This individual is a narrow ISA with an excellent squat and hip flexion, but a poor toe touch. So this is going to provide us a little bit of information. It's still incomplete, so we're going to make a couple of assumptions here, Brian, and I'm going to break this down for you piece by piece, and so we can get an idea of what we're actually looking at, and then we can come up with a bit of a solution. So let me grab the pelvis, as usual. Okay. So we've got a narrow ISA person. So we've got an inhaled representation of the pelvis and axial skeleton. We've got a counter-nutated sacrum, and so we're looking at something that looks like that from behind and something like that, give or take. A little crooked there. There we go. A little bit like that anteriorly. Now, so we've got a loss of bilateral hip ER. So we've got an anterior orientation from this representation, but let's think about this for a second. When we have a narrow ISA, we have to think about the compensatory sequence that arose as we get to this anterior orientation. Prior to that anterior orientation, you had an anterior compression, which is going to reduce hip IR. Now, by its bias alone, when we look at the inhaled representation of the axial skeleton, what we're going to do is we're going to bias it towards more ER, less IR to begin with. But in your case, you're also going to have that anterior compression. So we also know from your description that we're probably going to see an IR deficit. Now, let's put together some of the complex movements that you were talking about before. Squat is excellent, hip flexion is excellent, but toe touch is poor. So let's use the toe touch as a quick representation under these circumstances that we've already described. So for me to have a normal toe touch under this circumstance, I would have to be able to eccentrically orient the posterior musculature below the level of the trochanter. If I can't do that, then toe touch is going to be limited, but I can still squat and I can still get a good hip flexion measurement. But we're going to have to look at the compensatory strategy that we're looking at. So on the table, when we're looking at hip flexion under this circumstance, because you're narrow and because you're anteriorly oriented, you're more likely seeing a posterior orientation of the pelvis and the lumbar spine as you're moving into hip flexion, which is why you're getting such a good hip flexion measurement, but you can't access the toe touch. The squat is going to be a very similar representation. So as I squat, the substitution for the hip range of motion that I need to access as I sit down into the squat is, again, it's going to be posterior orientation of the pelvis and the lumbar spine as a unit that's going to allow me to capture that depth. Or I've got a unilateral compressive strategy on this side, and I'm using it sort of like a hip height cheat as I go through this middle range of the squat, which is going to allow me to access some internal rotation, and that would be my substitution. So the hip hike or a side bend through the trunk is going to provide me that substitution that's going to allow me to look like I have a pretty good representation of a squat. But the fact that you don't have the toe touch is kind of the dead giveaway that we still have this posterior compressive strategy. Now, from a solution standpoint, like I said, I really like where you're thinking about this in that 30 to 60 degree range. But here's what you're going to have to do. Because you most likely have some element of concentric orientation with this posterior lower compressive strategy, you're going to have to maintain hip internal rotation prior to the reorientation of the pelvis. So you're going to try to get a posterior orientation. The problem that's going to happen is if you don't do something to maintain hip internal rotation, which would be traditional adduction based on the position that you're describing, what's going to happen is I try to posteriorly orient. What you're going to get is you're going to get the little butt squeezer kind of person. So they've already got some concentric orientation here. They're going to magnify that as they try to posteriorly orient, and you're going to get the same substitution that you got on the table with hip flexion and the same substitution that you got with the squat. And all you're going to do is compress this even more. So what you're going to try to attempt to do is try to utilize hamstrings to get posterior orientation. All you're going to do is emphasize this compressive strategy. Now, if you maintain adduction internal rotation during that, then you're actually going to open up this pelvic outlet rather than compress it. And so some of the activities that you might need to do, if you're dealing with somebody with a painful situation or a lot of limitation or not a lot of movement experience, then maybe you start them in a hook lying position. But you're going to have to put something between their knees to help maintain the internal rotation moment at the hip prior to trying to create that reduction in the anterior orientation. From there, if you can bring them to their feet, then you're going to use partial squat variations, which I just love to death. So this might be some sort of a supported squat. So they're going to hold on to an upright, and you're going to move them through a partial squat, again maintaining the adduction internal rotation. We could use a TRX squat variation here, but always maintaining the hip internal rotation. From there, you want to build them downward so they can get to a parallel squat without a compensatory strategy. So you'll have to monitor the internal and external rotation of the hip after you do these activities to make sure that you are recapturing position. So once you can maintain internal and external rotation, now you take them out into the gym, and now we're to half kneeling variations, we're in split squat variations, we're able to do step ups with cross connects, and then that can move towards something even more dynamic if we've got an athlete in this situation where we're moving towards A marches with cross connects forwards and backwards, A skips, etc. And so we're moving towards a very, very dynamic situation there. But again, I think that it's the way you start this that's going to be most important for you, Brian, is to make sure you maintain the adduction internal rotation. But again, I think your foundational strategy is right on. So I hope that helps. If it doesn't, then ask me another question. Ask BillHartman@gmail.com. And you guys have a great day, and I'll see you later.